and welcome to Your Killer Life. We are so excited to have you join us on this next episode. I am one of your hosts today, Tammey Woodford.
I am Griff Woodford.
And we are excited to be talking with you today about the fear of love and bonding and commitment in the midst of loss and trauma. And specifically, of course, with breast cancer. On episode 8, we talked about sex and intimacy and, sort of recovering those aspects of life. And we mentioned, but we didn't really dig into the fact that I really did have a hard time with bonding. And you had sort of decided to step in, which was amazing. And for those that didn't listen to that episode, my ex-husband had asked for a divorce a couple weeks before my diagnosis. He pretty much, I had let him know that I thought I had breast cancer and had made the doctor appointment. And he didn't make it to the starting line on that. And then a few months, and we were already friends.
Yeah.
And for some reason, you decided to step up and step in. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that too.
Sure.
But I also, and that's sort of the reason for this episode, I was very guarded and not wanting to love or invite intimacy, that type of intimacy into my life.
Right.
Yeah. So did you want to add anything to that?
Well, no. I mean, I think that pretty well describes the scenario. I would add to that from my perspective, beginning the relationship, which at first was, of course, friendship, and I don't really want to say like a guidance type relationship, but there's the deep friendship, and then realizing that you are now in crisis and you're alone. Not the only reason, but I'll say one of the more important reasons, and one of the reasons that allowed me to, I guess, be able to understand some of the difficulties for you, is because I have had a life that is consistent in hardship, certainly up until we met, and knowing what it does take to get out of that, to recover from it, and still be able to pursue a healthy, happy life. I know and knew how to navigate suffering, and it's a skill. Quite frankly, it's a trained and practiced skill, which most people really aren't aware of, whether out of necessity or refusal. So, a large portion of me going into that role is knowing that you needed help, and knowing that of anyone else I knew, I would be the best fit for that.
So one of the things that we've not talked about yet on the podcast is that you also have experienced loss through cancer.
Yes.
And so you have seen what that looks like as a person goes from being diagnosed to saying goodbye.
Yes.
And I know for me, part of why I didn't want to bond with anyone is because I didn't want to allow someone to love me.
And then lose that, have it taken. Yes. Yeah. And that's, to anyone listening, and obviously to you, that is a very natural response. I mean, I've can think of a few times and instances in my own life where I refused attachment based on what I was doing, the danger in what I was doing, whether it's career, occupation, or just bad choices. But no, and so I certainly recognized that, and did what I could to address it, of course. But again, having seen the process before with very close loved ones who were killed by the disease or the treatment of the disease, is knowing that because what it looked like you were going to be facing, that you couldn't do it alone. And if I needed to even just be a stepping stone for you to recover, then that was, I was happy with that. In fact, in the beginning, that was really kind of the outlook on the relationship is, it doesn't matter if this goes into something romantic or goes into a marriage. It's not why I'm here. It's that I know I can fill a very specific role for you because you are in dire need of it. And, that allowed me to persevere when things were really hard.
So I'm still, all of these years later, amazed that with the very personal and close loved ones that you have lost and going through that you did decide that, hey, I could do this again and I can risk this part of me. And I did not make it easy on you.
Not at first. No, not at first.
I know for me, there was not just the fear of hurting you and the pain and loss on your end. I mean, to me, that felt unjust and unfair. And so it wasn't something that I wanted to do to someone. And I think part of that is because I had felt so abandoned. And so, I did not want to put that on someone else. I didn't want to open that door for someone else. And then my family, right? Like seeing their reaction and their pain to my diagnosis and the fear of loss and how they were dealing with it. I just really could not think of anything more painful to do to someone than to allow it at that moment. And so I really did emotionally block love. And I know we're not going to talk about drugs on this episode, but and we are going to talk about that on a future episode. That helped me in some ways to continue to be numb, post-operatively with narcotics.
Sure.
And
yep.
all of the stuff that was tossed at me, which we dubbed the Elvis Presley repair kit.
Yep.
So that helped me to maintain that distance, but that really was such a hard thing for me. And then on top of that, I was already experiencing so much loss in my life, loss of career, loss of future.
20-year marriage. Yeah.
Right.
All of the above. Like pretty much every discernible aspect of your life, something was being actively taken from you or had already been taken.
Yes. And that trauma, I will say, it continues even now. There are things that, I don't want to say self-sabotage, but it might come across that way, like getting fit again, because you've been with me throughout all this. Like I would just get momentum back and then I would get hit with another surgery or something like that. So it was just constantly this reclamation and loss and reclamation and loss and reclamation and loss. And I was just, Yeah.
So I'd ask you the question of what, if you can recall, what was the defining moment where that wall dropped, where you realized for whatever reason that this was worth the investment, and what were the catalysts to that?
Was always worth the investment. It was whether or not it was worth the risk.
Sure.
And that your persistence, I think, more than anything, and then you opening up and letting me know. I think once I understood your background with your grandmother and with your stepdad, I understood, and also getting to know you better. Knowing you as a friend is one thing. When being abandoned like that at the beginning of my diagnosis really damaged my ability to trust that anyone would be there.
Oh, sure.
And, you and I had conversations, no joke, like I'll just Uber back from the OR tomorrow. It's fine. I'll figure it out on my own. Right. But you just kept showing me that I could depend on you. And you just kept showing me that you were up for the challenge and willing to accept that loss. But probably what really changed it is the moment that I realized that you were on my side and you were true to your word and that you mentally could handle it. And so we went through a lot of things. I mean, it was probably, I don't know if you remember, but it was probably a good year of me being like, okay, kid, whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's maybe a little bit less, but yeah, within that, certainly within that frame, yeah.
Yeah. And so it really was just sort of this realization of your tenacity that you're just sticking with it. And at some point, I finally felt safe. And it was that safety which was so scary, to be vulnerable enough to allow the feeling of safety. I cannot stress that.
Yeah. And I think that there are a lot of really important takeaways from both sides of this conversation for our listeners, particularly ones who are going through, long-term or chronic diseases, cancer, the list goes on, and all of the effects that coincide with that of particularly on the, well, not particularly, but within both parties is understanding that these are genuine hurdles that every person will face. And to think that it doesn't apply or that it's not applicable or that there aren't skills that are required in order to navigate this successfully is frankly self-sabotaging, whether through naivety or just unwillingness to believe the actual reality. So, transposing that to others, particularly in the beginning of a long-term disease. And I mean, in our case, we're a little bit different, as it wasn't just the beginning of a long-term disease. It was the beginning of a romantic relationship, right. So it was this, kind of exponentially more difficult scenario. I mean, it's, I won't say typically, but very often, or I suppose the most relatable is, people had been together for 3, 5, 6, 8, 12 years. I mean, we think about like average age of long-term illness diagnosis, I mean, that's typically indicative of someone or a couple who's been together for a little while. So there's already this kind of assumed safety from both people. You've been around each other enough to know that you can be relied on, even if only for certain things. That begins to change when that disease does, well, I guess the processes also of the disease now begin to take the center stage of daily life. Because it's not what that relationship was based on. It's not what that relationship is used to. So understanding the individual realities for both people, the victim of the disease, that fear and that unwillingness to put someone else through that, the potential of loss. That's a real thing. It's a very human thing. It's we'd probably call that a unilateral feeling for people, especially for those who really care about each other. I mean, I love you. I don't want to cause you harm, so go away. You don't want to be here for this. Where in reality, yeah, we do. Yes, we do want to be here for this. And it's not your decision, ultimately, to say, I can or cannot love you and support you through this.
Oh, my goodness. So you saying just that actually brings tears to my eyes, because so many times you would say to me,
it's not your choice.
It's not your choice. You don't get to tell me who to love. You don't get to tell me.
Right.
And that was a big part of it, because wanting to put up that wall for both of us was definitely something, that I was desperately trying to do. And you... Yeah. You weren't having it.
No. Nope.
He was not having it. So, there is so much with with that loss and with that fear and introducing someone into your life. And you're right, we didn't have that existing relationship, that long-standing years of knowing what to expect. And so,
Right.
You just kind of jumped in, and we're learning to figure this out and what to expect. And in some ways, you knew what to expect from cancer and the treatment side more than I did.
Right. No, I understood the physical processes, the medical processes, what to expect physically and to a degree, emotionally and psychologically. I saw the suffering that my stepdad and my grandmother went through, both of whom were very impactful in my life and I was very close to. And I think, another part of that, because of that experience, I noticed that people who were close to those people did withdraw. There were people who just didn't come around anymore, and to a degree, I was one of them. With my grandma in particular, because of my age, I was very young, and my dad had just been killed a couple years prior. It was just more than I could deal with. Like I not just not knowing what to do, but just not knowing how to cope with the fear and the feelings of predetermined loss that were so present every time that I would be in the same room with Graham, and knowing that other people are going to do the same thing to you. And that's a terrible place to imagine yourself as the person who has had no choice. They've had no say in the matter whether or not they get this illness, and to be left like that for a very human reason, and then not out of spite or anger or anything like that. Just that these are things that really do require skill and practice in navigating. And that's some of our earlier podcasts was, that difference between strength and hardness, and the matrices of those, the aspect of being hard, and that often will include, would include, the use of substances to try and deal, like just not wanting to be present in that crucible, which again, it's a very human response, and that's in some ways my view of illnesses like that, or just loss in general, just suffering in general, it's training. You are being trained to be able to step up to the person who really matters the most to you, who really needs you the most. And that was, again, the initial desire to be that person for you, because I knew I could be. Even just for the fact that I'm still alive and not incarcerated, I know that I have skills and I have practice in those skills that you don't have.
Were you scared?
Well, define scared. What? Because I think there's a lot of things to be scared of, but what is your definition of that?
Well, the context of it is just emotionally opening yourself to a relationship and having that taken away. Was that something that you emotionally had to somehow process? I don't know if scared would be the right word.
There was only one time, a single time, and that is when you called me saying that you'd just been diagnosed. Remember, I was at the burger stand.
Yeah.
I just got back from the first pin and stretch massage I did, and you said, it's a huge mass. It's stage 3, maybe stage 4, and just like that, the initial uncertainty of, well, that sounds lethal to me. based on the experiences in particular with cancer that I'd had, that sounds like a death sentence. So that before there was any other information, before there was any reading of notes or data or procedural doctrine or anything like that, there was that fear of your time is short. But again, when I think of fear, particularly in that context, I don't think it was ever fear of my own loss. It was fear of yours, fear of you losing something, you losing your life, losing happiness, direction, hope. So, it was what that diagnosis would mean to you in that moment.
So later, as we stepped into a relationship, which you were willing to do before me, did it ever cross your mind that it would come to an untimely end? Was that ever a concern or a fear?
No, actually. And I remember you and I had kind of went round around about that in particular for a while of, me knowing that you're going to be fine.
Right.
And you refusing to believe that on the basis of how do you know? How do you know? Well, it's the same reason I know that the sun is going to rise in the east and set in the west tomorrow. It's the same reason I know that I love you. Like, there's nothing tangible about that. There's no proof that I love you, but I know that subconscious, that preconscious, that spiritual voice, that deeper connection to the world in which you live, the electromagnetic vibrational fields, however, pick a culture and they'll describe it to you in a different way. But that certainty, not based on data or fact, but that certainty based on everything that you know on a subconscious level, that you are going to be fine.
It's interesting because I do remember those conversations and being absolutely pissed off that you would say that.
I know. Yeah, I remember.
Because how could you know? And you don't know. And how dare you tell me that I'm going to be okay? And how dare you try and give me hope in the midst of this? Because you don't know. You don't know. And I think there are probably a few of my breasties out there listening that are going, exactly, you don't know. How dare you say that? Yeah. How dare you give me more false promise and more false hope when you cannot quantify or guarantee or promise that this is going to be a thing. And it is such a difficult place to be in. And that's again, that fear of love in the midst of loss. You just are surrounded. It's like your life is just crumbling around you. You don't want to put any hope into something that might not be there. Yeah. Men included.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that's just kind of the default setting for people in general. Once you reach a certain point of trauma or loss or just being completely overwhelmed, that the idea of feeling hopeful about anything feels like a betrayal.
Yes.
But again, back to my very first premise of, because of all the suffering that I've endured and the way that I have managed to kind of see my way through it in a positive sense, is understanding that hope is the most important aspect of going through something like that. And even whether it's not hope of surviving something, none of us got this alive, but the hope of, because I'm going through fill in the blank, I will be better at fill in the blank because of it.
Right.
And that was another very definitive aspect of my prerogative of our relationship. This every day is hard. Every day is uncertainty. And every day in some aspect is potential fear, potential loss. But knowing that by me exposing myself to that, and not just as an individual, but as a unit, that strengthens us, that makes us stronger, that makes us more capable, makes us wiser. And through that strength, wisdom, and capability, hope just materializes. Learning, well, I wouldn't say learning, but having the ability to take that, brief step out of yourself and realize where you actually are as opposed to where you might feel like you are. Realize that you are still standing. You can still smile. And you love each other. Those are all really significant gifts. And the fact that both or either of us are able to do that in the midst of all of that, that is a tremendous gift.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
You had sort of back to that confidence that you had that everything is going to be fine. It was last year, I think, that you admitted that every time I went into surgery, which really felt like all the time.
Right.
That it did. Every 3 to 6 months. Here we go again.
Yep.
Every time I went into surgery, that was also a moment of fear because that was the riskiest.
Yeah, that was really, I remember a couple of other individual instances where that touch of fear occurred, but that was certainly the most consistent one because I have a pretty good idea of what goes into surgery. And because you didn't go through the chemo or radiation, but you are still immune compromised. You still have inherent weaknesses within the system because of all the physical trauma you've been suffering, that you're that much more susceptible to a microgram worth of miscalculation in anesthesia. A surgeon who's been up for 18 hours as opposed to 8 hours. There's so many variables that really have hardly anything to do with the disease itself, and that neither of us have any control over or any even real knowledge of. It's something that we don't get to ask. How well have you slept, doctor?
Right.
Just those small things like that. And because of my background in special operations, U.S. military, I learned that that's how things go catastrophic, is the inability to address the small details. That cascading effect of missing one thing here and then another thing there, or misjudging something. The devil being in the details, as it were.
Right.
That was the most apprehensive, and it's going to sound a little bit arrogant, but because that was the one part of you and I that I did not have any say in. I didn't have any direct hands-on ability to correct a problem when you were behind the curtain. Everywhere else, I could apply input. I could apply my skills, my attention to detail, my intuition based on what I know of you. Being able to just know when you're hurting from across the room without having to say anything. Like, know before you do that you are in pain somewhere, and now I can address that. So there's, again, just that feeling of I don't have the ability to influence this particular part, and it's an important part. So that was where those moments of fear would come from. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was pleasantly clueless because I had never had a major
Right.
anything before. I had never broken a bone. I hadn't had, I think I had general anesthesia one other time, and that's when I had foot surgery. And so, but which was really minor. And not that general anesthesia is ever minor. Right. Yeah. That is kind of a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And trust me, the first time as we're talking intubation with the anesthesiologist, and I'm like, wait, what? You're going to what? Like,
Yeah, they do lots of stuff to you when you're asleep.
no idea. And it's interesting because we are going to do an episode on pain because it's not arrogant at all when you say you realizing that I'm in pain before I would, because I had gotten to the point where pain had become my 24/7, 365 companion.
Yeah.
And I had adapted to it, and I would push through and just try and ignore it. And you would see where it was sort of crossing over with, and I'll never forget the time. I shouldn't spoil that episode, but I'll never forget the time you were like, no, you need to take something. You need to take something. And I had worked all day and whatever. And I finally took one of my pain meds. And like 30 minutes later, I felt my face relax. Like that's how much pain I had in my body.
Yeah.
And it's something that I also don't think gets discussed enough. So we'll do an episode on that. You know, when you asked me earlier, sort of, well, how did you know, and when did you finally realize that you're going to be here and that I can count on you?
Right.
And it's sort of those 1,000 little things. It is because, I think back to just examples of, as odd as this sounds, like, you become the boob inspector, and not in the way that all the guys would be thinking, yay, but
not what's on the mug. No.
Right. I can't see underneath half the time, especially post-op. I'm not necessarily 100% there because of the narcotics I'm taking or just, coming out of surgery, which you were always so good at reminding me, because I am impatient and I am capable, and I have not ever had to depend on someone like I was required to do throughout some of this process. And that was also very hard for me. So that was probably another part of why I put up that wall. But you having to be the one to look at sutures and look at the bruising and look at the places that I couldn't see, when I couldn't wash my hair because I had Tyrannosaurus X arms, and you're like, that's okay, I'll figure it out. And washing my hair, it's all of those. So they can sound so minor, and yet they're so meaningful.
Big deals in the moment, and both preceding and afterward, they're big deals. And I think that's actually probably something that will be really helpful to viewers, particularly ones that are going through similar circumstances, is, you don't get to that level of intimacy and trust and safety, just general security and dependability by one big grand gesture. That's not a quantifiable resource for putting your faith in somebody. It's the 1,000 little wins, the thousands of those little bits of attention to detail that seem relatively innocuous in the moment, enough that you notice them and you're aware of them, but don't seem to have a tremendous amount of impact. And then you realize there's been 1,000 of those or 10,000 of those. And it's this consistent pattern that whoever that is putting my own needs above yours putting your needs above my own when it's appropriate and when it's necessary.
Yeah.
That's what dependability is. It's never the big grand gesture. It is always the long, steady game.
And that could not have always been easy. And I know that there were times we do honesty on this show. That's just the way it is. Unscripted honesty. But, because doing that is hard in the first place, putting your needs, putting someone else's needs above your own is a difficult thing, especially if you're, I hate to say it, but like, there's not going to be an instant reward, right? Like the reward is that I have clean hair, but for you, like you're just cleaning up the bathroom and the mess that we made.
I'm soaking wet and have to mop the floor. Right.
Right. So that.
Yeah.
So there is a huge element to that is really that gift and that consistency and ability to continue to have grace. And I was not always on my best behavior and we'll talk about that in another episode too, because some of the drugs made me cranky and some of them made me depressed and some of them, right, there were, and then coming out of surgery. And you were always so good, as impatient as I was, to remind me that healing was coming out of a knife fight, even if it was a sterile knife fight.
Right.
Still got hit by a Mack truck and and still had a lot of work and a lot of healing to do. And I think that is something also that with breast cancer can be a challenge because the skin heals pretty quickly.
Right. Nothing else does. And I would say in particular breast cancer, maybe not putting that necessarily above other diseases, but just the hardship that comes with that, the healing that is so much more than can just be seen or even immediately felt, and not just in the physical sense either, but the psychological and emotional sense of the person who's been diagnosed and is going through all of these medical interventions and reconstructions. I mean, again, just sterile knife fight after sterile knife fight after sterile knife fight. And got the psychological toll on that is just immense. It's absolutely immense. And again, one of the things that I think allowed us to be successful was my knowledge of that going into it. There were certainly things I was not prepared for as far as our relationship type thing. The difficulties that we would have, some of those I did not foresee, and that's why there were difficulties. But knowing that, your survival journey on this is going to be intensive. You are going to live. You are going to survive, and you will end in the place that you want to end. I knew that within a couple weeks of your diagnosis. I knew that. I just, the same way you love somebody. I also knew that it was going to be a very long and difficult road. I had no misconceptions of the endurance that was going to be required for both of us. And I think it's it's critical that any of our listeners or viewers that are looking at this diagnosis or a similar diagnosis or are in the beginning stages of a diagnosis like that both parties must be very certain that this is going to take a long time and it is going to be very difficult. And equally on that, be certain that you want to do this with the other person. Because it's going to end really badly if you don't have those already on board.
I know that in addition to the fear of losing someone, and so not being willing to be vulnerable in that way and invite love in your life because of the feeling of loss. I know that there's also, and I will say, I went through a little bit of this myself, when my ex-husband said to me, "You've got to take me back," after the diagnosis was confirmed. And I said, no, there was still that part of, well, should I settle? Because, who the hell is going to want to be with me after, I'm all Frankenstein? And we are not nice to ourselves when we talk about ourselves in this process.
No.
But it's also a very hard thing because we have the scars and you saw the violence of it. You saw the aftermath of it.
Yep.
And so I think that that's a bit of a challenge too, which is also still a fear of loss of, am I going to be able to find that someone that is still going to, so we settle. Am I going to be able to find someone who's going to love me as I am, as I look, with my defects and all? And not that any of us, I have a scar on my knee from when I was 7. So it's not like I don't have any scars. I'm not perfect. Was never perfect. So, but there's still that fear of loss, I think, in either direction, especially and that fear of love, whether or not you'll be able to find love.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Kind of brings up the reality that any situation like that, and particularly, a long-term disease diagnosis, it brings out individual selfishnesses, like the plural of selfishness, right? Whether rational or irrational, because there is such an amount of strain on both parties that it comes to your attention very quickly. It just does, not if anything. It comes to your attention very quickly where some of those irrational pieces of selfishness exist. Whether it's feeling like you don't have enough time in the bathroom in the morning, or am I going to be pretty enough for someone who has already proven that they love me without condition? Those are obviously two quite large extremes, but realizing where the irrational pieces of selfishness come from, and being able to address those is, which I know, at least for me, was very important in a few aspects, without getting into a lot of detail, because I don't really have a lot of individual detail, or just this awareness that, these things that I was trying to keep for myself, or allow myself, that really made no sense, but for some reason were so important, so I would feel like I'm not being misused or something like that. You have a lot of opportunity for introspection and for growth. I mean, that's I would say probably the most gratitude I feel for that whole process is exactly that, is just the opportunity to really get a handle on a lot of things that were, I don't know if self-harming is the right word, but irrational selfishness that would self-sabotage is I guess being able to call myself out on that and find the reality behind those. I don't think that's really making a whole lot of linear sense, but it provides you a lot of opportunity for introspection and growth. Leave it at that. And both parties, and being able to facilitate and help that with both parties. That's what really awesome marriages are built out of.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting thing, because I would say that it wasn't easy, but I would also say that it wasn't hard. It was just complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Well, yeah. I mean, there's individuals, certainly, there are bad days. There are really hard days. But I wouldn't say any of it was nothing ever felt cruel. Nothing, well, I can't say nothing felt unfair, but as far as what you and I were going through together, it didn't, it always felt like an equal burden, and a burden that was worth it. It felt like the yokes that we both, lived under for a couple of years were very well suited to us. And the yokes that we were wearing in those during that time has allowed us to till the fields of our future.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, so far it's good.
Yeah, it's a lot better than good.
I love that. Thank you for all of the midnight yogurt covered pretzels to go with my pain meds.
Yeah. Yep.
Washing my hair.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, helping me remove surgical tape.
Yeah, boy, that was
stuff.
An ordeal. Yeah, terrible.
Stripping drains. Another lovely, lovely thing.
Yeah, dripping and measuring and expressing, all that.
That's good stuff.
Well, of course it's difficult. And, one thing I can certainly say about long-term illness, disease, is it takes all of the mystery out of a relationship. So if that's part of the reason why you're with that person, rethink that carefully. As you're not going to have secrets. There's not going to be any mysterious aspects of that relationship. You are going to know each other out of necessity, to the same degree that you know yourself.
Which is powerful and terrifying, and it requires willingness and vulnerability.
Yes.
And it is very difficult. That is very difficult.
Yes, it is.
So, what advice when it comes to fear of love in the midst of loss would you want to leave folks with as we wrap up?
I think probably two main aspects of that, of realizing, and in the case of long-term disease diagnosis or going through it, but I mean, that transfers into many other things, just surviving trauma, getting through trauma, whether it's the active process of it or it's the aftermath, is you do not accomplish anything on your own. You don't. There's no way a single person can go through something that life-altering, that in some cases demeaning, and that unfair. You don't survive that on your own. You simply don't. The caveat to that is there also needs to be an internal selection process. That mentioned earlier, that single gesture, that grand gesture, is not grounds to allow another person into that depth of vulnerability and honesty. I don't really have a doctrine for that selection process, but I knew that for me personally, I had this inquantifiable knowledge that however difficult the day was, the activity, the argument, the fight was, I knew that it was a price I was willing to pay. You're welcome. So I think that would be what I would leave this on.
We want to thank you for joining us today again on Your Killer Life. And we would love to hear your stories. So if you are watching on YouTube, if you are on the Facebook page or even out on the website, we would appreciate really your feedback, your thoughts as we continue to dance through these really tough topics. And I appreciate the openness. I just have to say, I appreciate this is who you are all the time anyway. And we'll definitely have a conversation in the future about using words and communication.
Yeah, right. Yes.
But I appreciate that so much. And to our listeners, we really would love to hear from you too. And thank you so much for continuing to share the podcast and to leave feedback and subscribe and like. So thank you for joining us. And until next time, keep living your killer life.
Bye, guys.